Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Economic Club of Chicago's 301st dinner meeting. It is my great pleasure to introduce our members seated at the dais. As I announce their names, I will ask that each stand and remain standing. And please hold your applause until all introductions are complete. So to my far left, Mary Sue Barrett, President, Metropolitan Planning Council. David B. Weinberg, Chairman and CEO, Judd Enterprises. James Hill Jr., Chairman, Hill Taylor, and a Director of the club. Ella D. Struble, Managing Director, Eloquent Design, and a member of the Executive Committee. Robert J. Stucker, Partner and President, Vedder, Price, Kaufman, and Kamholtz. Ronald J. Gidwitz, Partner, GCG Partners. Jonathan P. Ward, Chairman and CEO, the Service Master Company, and a Director of the club. Linda Wolf, Chairman and CEO, Leo Burnett Worldwide, and Chair of the Reception Committee. Jonathan F. Fanton, President, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. James J. O'Connor, Retired Chairman and CEO, Unicon Corporation. James S. Crown, General Partner, Henry Crown and Company. Christine A. Edwards, Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer, Bank One Corporation. John W. Rogers, Jr., Chairman and CEO, Ariel Capital Management, and a Director of the club. Larry McCracken, Vice President Communications, The Boeing Company. Richard L. Thomas, Retired Chairman, First Chicago NBD Corporation, and a past President of the club. To my far right, Hans R. Willeman, General Manager, Four Seasons Hotel, Chicago. Michael Arrington, Chairman and CEO, Recon Management Services. Sheila A. Penrose, President, the Penrose Group. Gerald J. Roper, President and CEO, Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce. David P. Storch, President and CEO, AAR Corporation, and a Director of the club. J. Douglas Gray, Special Advisor, William Blair and Company, and a Director of the club. Adele S. Simmons, Vice Chairman, Chicago Metropolis 2020. John D. Mabee, Chairman, Mid-Continent Capital. James W. Compton, President and CEO, Chicago Urban League. James N. Guyette, President and CEO, Rolls-Royce North America. Sandra P. Guthman, President and CEO, the Polk Brothers Foundation. C. Stephen McMillan, Chairman, President, and CEO, Sara Lee Corporation, and a Director of the club. Lester Crown, Chairman, Material Services Corporation, and Chairman of the Program Committee. Miles D. White, Chairman and CEO, Abbott Laboratories, and a Director of the club. Now let's give them a round of applause. Running any large corporation in today's economy is a challenge, but when that corporation is a major airline in the post-9/11 world, challenge doesn't quite capture the dimensions of the burden. Last year, United Airlines declared bankruptcy, while American Airlines losses exceeded $3 billion. Meanwhile, Delta, the nation's third largest airline, closed the year about $1.3 billion in the red. In the face of all this, our speaker today has decided to launch a new airline to compete with JetBlue, Southwest, and other no-frills airlines that are redefining the economics of flying. While the rest of the world stands in awe of this strategy, which columnist George Wilk called an act of business bravado akin to Henry Luce's launch of Fortune magazine in the middle of the Depression, those of us who know Leo Mullin from his 15-plus years in Chicago are not the least bit surprised. Leo has relished challenge since his youth in Boston, competing in athletics and academics with his 6 brothers. Armed with a bachelor's, master's, and MBA from Harvard, he began his career as a McKinsey consultant. He then joined Conrail as Senior Vice President of Strategy, where he was credited with helping Conrail become profitable. He moved here in 1981 to join First Chicago Bank, and he spent the next 15 years in roles of progressively greater responsibility, becoming president and chief operating officer in 1993. Given the magnitude of what he's facing in his current position, he might look back wistfully to his days at First Chicago, when his major challenge was putting a positive spin on the $3 teller fee he instituted. After First Chicago merged with NBD in 1995, Leo became a vice chairman of Unicom. As always, he was not a caretaker, but a thoughtful risk taker, as he helped guide the company through a crucial phase of deregulation. Besides his business accomplishments, Leo has long been recognized for strong community leadership. While in Chicago, he had a distinguished record of civic involvement, including work with juvenile diabetes, the Metropolitan Planning Council, and the Urban League. He chaired the Field Museum Board, where he demonstrated common sense yet outside-the-box thinking by tapping an experienced businessman rather than a curator to run the museum and help it craft a highly successful long-run strategy. I had the personal pleasure of working with Leo on the Commercial Club's Metropolis project, which sought business input on a host of regional planning issues. And Leo successfully chaired the Transportation Committee. And I think it's worth noting that soon afterwards, he moved on to join a major transportation company. Maybe we trained him too well. Leo was so well-liked and respected here in Chicago that it was a bittersweet day for all of us when he announced in 1997 that he was leaving for Atlanta to become chairman and CEO of Delta Airlines. But we knew that our loss would be a tremendous gain for both Delta and Atlanta, and so it has proved. Leo has become active in Atlanta's civic community, and he quickly distinguished himself among airline CEOs. He was the obvious choice to head the delegation of airlines seeking federal assistance in the aftermath of 9/11, and his lobbying skills paid off when Congress enacted a $15 billion assistance package, giving airlines the breathing room to restructure. He has been unusually blunt about the challenges facing the airline industry, but nevertheless upbeat about its prospects for survival. Leo's a great friend to many of us and an inspiration to all of us, but especially to those who, like Leo, have taken up another challenge late in life: golf. A game he has attacked with a vengeance. Witnesses report that Leo gets more out of his swing than anyone they know. At last count, his handicap was down to a respectable 24, a sure sign that he is still spending more time in the office than on the driving range. Now, don't be fooled by his youthful demeanor. He's a recent grandfather and has been known to take advantage of the senior discount at the movie theater. In short, he's been around a long time, and he has the wisdom and the experience to prove it. Please join me in welcoming Leo Mullin.
Thank you very much, and it's absolutely terrific to be back here. And Dick, I thought that $3 fee was a good idea, didn't you? Right. That was a very warm introduction, and I'm just so pleased to be back here for so many reasons, to be in the company of so many friends. It's just been an extraordinary experience in the last day and a half, and so I deeply appreciate it. I'm particularly appreciated to be associated here with the Economic Club of Chicago. As Mike, one thing that Mike did not mention in his introduction is that at one point I was an officer of the Economic Club. I actually served for 2 years as the chairman of the Questions Committee under both John Bryan and Pat Ryan. And that was a responsibility that I enjoyed immensely, defining questions that would clearly enlighten but perhaps had a little bit of an edge to them. And one of my favorite anecdotes from that time concerns my good friend Sam Skinner, who was then Secretary of Transportation, who spoke here in 1989. Following Sam's speech, John Bryan referred to the sheet I had provided him, and he asked the first question, and Sam looked uncomfortable. After the second question, he looked downright irritated. And after the third, Sam exclaimed, "Who prepared these questions? Some academic preparing for his PhD exam?" So if Sam were here, I'd say the academic is back. And I'll just wait and see how these questions go at the end. This evening, I am going to speak about one of America's greatest industries, an economic sector with enormous scope and notable contributions to the public. Every day, in cities large and small across our nation, more than 22,000 flights depart, carrying more than 1.5 million passengers safely to their destinations. Airlines play a crucial role in moving people and goods around the world, and in the process, they help to create a global forum for the free exchange of culture, ideas, and political thought. It is widely accepted that aviation is the backbone of our nation's second largest industry, travel and tourism, which accounts for approximately 10% of the GDP of this country. In essence, the U.S. airline industry is very large, very effective, absolutely essential for our economy and way of life, and, unfortunately, as a business model, it is badly broken. As we meet tonight, 100 years after the first flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903, this is an industry in crisis, but not for the first time. The roller coaster style of the airline business has been vividly conveyed in a book titled Hard Landing, written by Thomas Petzinger in 1995. Petzinger defined the theme of his book in circus-scary terms, saying that it was about, quote, men who tried to earn a profit from the tightrope act. He laid out the saga of the post-1978 deregulation period. As he describes, many companies had, by the mid-1990s, already fallen from the tightrope. Eastern, Pan Am, People's Express, and Braniff, to name a few. And last year, this venerable list was joined by another household name, TWA. Yet while aviation has had a continuous wild ride throughout its first 100 years, aviation has always come back, continuing to fulfill the service role that seemed to be its destiny. Now, and I clearly do not have to tell the residents of Chicago this news, we are in yet another airline crisis. The question, though, is whether this is simply one more transient tale, as all of the others have been, wherein following a little corporate pain, a sense of normalcy will soon return. Or is this crisis somehow different? Is it more threatening to the future of air travel on a more fundamental level? I think to most of us, this one does feel different. And in my judgment, it is the second, more troubling view that is correct. Despite this, however, I do believe there is a good chance that the airline industry, 3 or so years from now, could be strong again, maybe stronger than at any time in its history. But the transitional period that we are now in, which will continue for at least 2 to 3 years, will be painful to many of aviation's constituencies. In addition, a positive outcome will depend on the crucial actions of a key group of aviation leaders, coupled with major shifts in policy by the federal government. And tonight, I want to define for you what must happen to stop this relentless downward spiral of this industry, and thereby to enable the airlines to first survive and then thrive in the years ahead. Now, in beginning to think about what lies ahead for our nation's airlines, it's helpful to develop a picture of where we are today. And to start, I'd like to take you back to February 10th, 1997, to the ballroom of the Hyatt Regency Hotel here in Chicago. It was the night of the Economic Club of Chicago event. I remember well the speaker, for I, like many of you, was in the audience that night. It was Bob Crandall, then Chief Executive Officer of American Airlines. I had no real knowledge of the airline business at that time. Little did I know that by the end of the year, I too would be an airline CEO. But from my years in banking, I knew it was a tough industry. In fact, and this is a fact, if you added together the losses and profits of the airline industry from its earliest days in 1903 until 1997, when Bob Crandall was speaking, the sum total of the profits of the industry was below zero. I remember Bob's remarks that night for their raw nature and the difficulties of the situation he described. He talked about some of the industry's intractable issues at the time, including ruinous overcapacity, as airlines pursued too little demand with too many seats. The industry's inability, due to governmental policy strictures, to use free market tools open to all other industries, tools such as alliances and mergers, to bring about much-needed restructuring. He referred to labor costs that had become unsustainably high. And even in 1997, with the need to ensure the security of air travel without making the hassle factor so overwhelming that no one would want to fly. So what happened in the next 4 years up until 2001? Did capacity finally come under control and begin to grow at reasonable rates so that pricing power returned to the airlines? Did governmental policies get changed in order to allow the industry to undertake badly needed restructuring? Did the industry get costs, especially labor costs, under control? And was the hassle factor in aviation security brought to a reasonable level? The answer, of course, is no, 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 and no. Now, before I go on, I do want to note that some progress was made in those 4 years. The economy was good, and from 1996 to the year 2000, industry earnings were the best in airline history. Finally, if only briefly, the industry's sum total of losses and profits was a number greater than zero. International service was expanded internationally through the creation of global alliances, and domestically, the industry's significant investment in regional jets provided more and better service for our nation's smaller cities and towns. In addition, low-cost carriers flourished in this period, and technology, including greatly increased use of the internet to sell air travel, transformed the distribution of ticket sales in ways that were tremendously advantageous to the consumer. All these were good steps for our nation's flying public. But they were not sufficient to deal with the structural and policy concerns outlined by Bob Crandall in 1997. And they were certainly not enough to deal with the consequences of one of the greatest catastrophes of modern times, especially for aviation, the events of September 11th, 2001. September 11th is loaded with meaning for all of us, collectively as a country and individually. Country singer Alan Jackson captured it well in his song entitled, "Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning?" And each of you in this room knows where you were on that day. As you would expect, those were long and difficult days at Delta. On that terrible morning, as the reality of the situation became clear, we feared the possible presence of terrorists on every flight as we landed hundreds of airplanes at distant airports. And before they could be airborne once more, we had to begin the invention of a new aviation security regimen that would change the travel experience forever. I remember the feeling of personal anguish when I realized that Leia was in a Delta plane over New York City at the moment of catastrophe. And I recall just as vividly the feeling of relief an hour later when I learned her plane had been safely diverted to a small airport in Allentown, Pennsylvania. We as a country came together following September 11th, as our forebears have so repeatedly done throughout the great crises in our history. The trauma emanating from these events continues today as we face the enormous issues of war and peace. In this context, the issues of aviation are, of course, secondary, but nonetheless, the impact on our industry has been and continues to be immense. What, in a nutshell, has happened to the airline industry since September 11th? Simply stated, the key results are as follows. Aviation traffic, the number of people boarding our planes, has not recovered from the shock of September 11th and continues to run at about 11% below year 2000 levels based on the industry surveys. Due to the excess supply of seats as compared to demand, airlines have reduced capacity by approximately 13%, storing many of the unused aircraft at desert locations. Given the weak traffic and excess capacity, the industry has had virtually no pricing power since September 11th, so seats are selling well below cost. Discount carriers have continued to gain in strength, even as the internet has proven to be an increasingly powerful tool for customers shopping for cheap fares. As a result of these alterations, revenues have settled in at levels last seen in 1996. as though the good years of revenue gains between 1997 and 2000 simply never happened. In the face of these changes, airlines have not been idle. The industry has taken dramatic steps to reduce costs, manifested especially in the reduction of 100,000 employees from a previous total of 700,000. As the ripple effect of these reductions spreads, other industries have been impacted as well. Boeing, for example, has cut staffing in its commercial aviation unit by almost one-third during this period, from 96,000 down to 66,000. By any measure, the cost reduction programs already implemented, which will soon be supplemented by even more massive cost reductions to come, has been the most extensive in aviation history. Yet the bottom line results, manifested especially by the airline's $7 billion after-tax losses in 2002, appear not to show the effects. The depressed revenue picture, which happened so quickly and cut so deeply, provides part of the answer. But an almost equivalent part, a part unanticipated by all associated with aviation, asserted itself dramatically as the year 2002 went on. And that was the huge and unintended consequence of post-9/11 government policies regarding security. These policies have unloaded a huge negative financial burden on the industry. The burden is so significant that it is important to elaborate on it briefly. Let me reiterate at this point that Delta and the rest of the airline industry are fully supportive of the aviation security improvements which have occurred since September 11th. The government's intent was that every step it has taken be helpful to the airlines. However, the government failed to recognize that, as the cumulative weight of its actions and directives mounted, this help was actually burying the industry in a mountain of insurmountable financial problems. Delta provides, in some sense, a microcosm of the industry difficulties. In 2002, Delta had a pre-tax operating loss of $1.2 billion. Against this backdrop, let me list briefly the security-related components which have contributed to this situation. A new security tax of $2.50 per segment and other government fees cost Delta $325 million. The security tax was imposed on airline tickets to help offset the federal cost of security and was intended to be passed on to customers. But airlines have no pricing power, and because the seat supply so far exceeds passenger demand. In this high-capacity, low-demand environment, airline customers do not have to accept price increases, and they don't. They shop the internet for the lowest possible price, so airlines, by necessity, end up absorbing this new tax. Thus, what was intended to be a price add-on becomes instead an expense, making a direct hit to the airline's bottom line. Second point, increased terrorism insurance, $145 million. Terrorism insurance was essentially a throw-in item for our aviation insurance program prior to September 11th. It cost Delta $2 million in 2001. Following September 11th, premiums rose an incredible 700% to $145 million. Revenue losses due to new restrictions imposed on air carriage of U.S. mail as well as freight shippers, $80 million. This loss was due to the elimination of airlines' right to carry mail over 16 ounces in the cargo holds of our planes, as well as restrictions on the number of shippers we can serve. Some help has come back on that one. Loss in potential seat revenue is part of the Federal Marshall Program, $35 million. They occupy the space in the cabin closest to the cockpit, generally high-premium first-class seats, which the airlines cannot sell. And other mandated but unreimbursed costs, $115 million, which includes new requirements to increase ramp security, maintain checkpoints for document verification, add screening, catering, supplying services, as well as unreimbursed costs for the fortification of cockpit doors. The total impact of Delta alone from these items was $700 million. Extrapolated to the rest of the industry, the number rises to $4.3 billion. Not included in this total is the enormous revenue effect due to the reluctance of some passengers to fly because of the greatly increased security hassle factor. Delta's analysis of travel patterns since September 11th shows that while air travel has fallen overall, it has fallen 3 times as sharply on flights covering distances less than 400 miles. In other words, distance that can be driven in a day or less. The indication is that in many cases, travelers are choosing to drive whenever possible rather than deal with the real or perceived airport hassle factor. Additional analysis also shows that the time-sensitive business traveler, typically the most lucrative market segment for the airlines, has cut travel by 20%, twice as much as the leisure traveler. And estimates are that the revenue losses such as these due to the hassle factor could increase the $4 billion number mentioned earlier by as much as 50%, bringing the total financial carnage to our industry since September 11th to an annualized $6 billion or more. Compare this $6 billion number to the industry's pre-tax loss in 2002 of around $10 billion. Now you may ask at this point, where did the money come from to pay for all of this? In a nutshell, the industry borrowed to fund post-9/11 governmentally imposed security burdens. By June 2002, the debt had increased so much that the average carrier's debt-to-capitalization ratio was in excess of 90%, far higher than the average ratio for other publicly traded corporations, and up from 73% for the industry at the start of 2001. And perhaps, and most dramatically, two of the great names in aviation, United Airlines and U.S. Airways, have declared bankruptcy. So what do we do now? Let me state firmly that as the CEO of Delta Airlines, I believe that Delta will survive this and ultimately even thrive. Moreover, the same is possible for the rest of the industry that is currently solvent. But this can only happen if three major actions are undertaken immediately, not just for Delta, but for all components of aviation. The first item is that airlines themselves must continue a program of cost reductions that outsizes any undertaken in its history, fundamentally restructuring the way we do business. The employee reductions, I believe, have already been taken or are already programmed. I sincerely hope the steps so far will be enough, for any more could begin to severely challenge customer service levels. But labor contracts agreed to in prosperous times will need to be renegotiated. These are being reopened at most airlines, precipitated by the significant changes now being implemented at carriers already in bankruptcy. And airlines must ask for support from suppliers, financial organizations, airport operators, and others who have a huge stake in ensuring the success of the industry, stakeholders who, with some exceptions, have not felt nearly the impact or repercussions that has been borne by the airlines themselves. Second, the federal government must reset policies that are financially punishing the airline industry in order to provide a basis from which the self-help efforts can succeed. As I noted, the list of post-9/11 government-imposed security changes mentioned earlier had an estimated negative financial impact of approximately $4 billion on the industry. These aviation security changes are the direct result of our nation's war against terrorism. As such, and this is a crucial point I want to emphasize tonight, these costs are appropriately part of the national defense. No other industry is called upon to shoulder, through special taxation or federally imposed security costs, the burden of national defense. It has always been funded through the general purpose funds which provide for all of national defense. Airlines, like all other industries, should be released from this unique burden. It is also time to note that even prior to September 11th, taxes on air travel have long been the highest of any industry. In fact, a 300 round-trip airplane ticket with a single connecting point is currently taxed at an astounding 26%. This is significantly higher than the 10% tax applied to purchase of handguns, or even the sin tax levels of 11% applied to distilled spirits, and the 18% applied to a pack of cigarettes, and clearly well above the zero tax applied to bus and rail travel. For our industry to recover, the government must remove both the unique burden of national security costs and the punishing level of taxation that continues to hobble the airline self-help efforts. Now, some would say that this request by the airline industry is a bailout. But let me state clearly that we are not looking for a bailout at all. In fact, we don't want any special treatment. On the contrary, we want to be treated like all other businesses, with security provided as part of the national defense responsibility and with a tax policy that is not uniquely burdensome. Third aspect is that the federal government must enable appropriate industry restructuring to take place. This includes those restructuring steps that the bankrupt carriers may choose to take, but it should also include mergers, alliances, or asset sales among the various carriers in the industry. Up to this point, the Departments of Justice and Transportation have followed a philosophy that has tended to discourage such actions. Given the current industry circumstances, all governmental assumptions about appropriate industry structure need to be re-examined. An industry structure that does not allow financial success for most of its participants is by definition a failure and can no longer be allowed to prevail. Now, as I close my remarks this evening, the obvious question is, can this three-step solution actually bring this industry back to its feet? While no one knows for sure, many of the right steps are already being taken. And decision makers, particularly in the public sector, know full well that our country crucially needs a vibrant aviation system to serve as the engine for a healthy economy. Optimism would clearly be too strong a word to describe my view. Rather, pragmatism involving the airlines, the government, and the industry stakeholders will likely dictate an appropriate outcome. But going back to my opening observations, it will continue to be a tightrope act. There's no doubt about that. But it is a tightrope act which aviation simply has to make it to the other side. For the benefit of America's traveling public and the customers we serve, I strongly believe we will. And I deeply appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about these issues here tonight. Thank you all very much.
United Airlines' Glenn Tilden is new to his job and a fellow CEO who came from outside the industry. So what advice would you offer to Mr. Tilden since he became the leader of UAL?
First, think twice. First of all, relative to United Airlines, I feel I know the company very well. Dick and I had a relationship a long time with United, with John Edwardson here through the First Chicago credit card program. And it is truly a great corporation, one of the greatest in America. In the aviation industry, United has got the greatest network of any airline company in the world. And it is a company whose brand is recognized worldwide. And in my judgment, it simply has to succeed in some way. In United's case, I think that the facts are that it truly had a situation where its costs got substantially out of control. I mean, the labor agreements that United signed throughout the latter part of the 1990s and into 2000 did set a standard for the rest of the industry and have caused a spiraling and a pattern bargaining type industry where the costs are really too high for the services to be rendered. We have a tremendous amount of competitive pressure in this industry that is supplied by the discount carriers, Southwest Airlines being the most notable among them. I think from a public interest standpoint that their strength is actually very, very good, and pricing pressure always needs to be placed on any kind of an industry. But this is an industry, and it has had United, unfortunately, somewhat more in the forefront, where all of the costs have been too high for too long, and if there is a silver lining at all on this, it is that the adjustments that we are making are in some senses, and unfortunately, overdue to make this a much more cost-competitive industry. Now, whether or not that can be carried out in a way where the pain, in fact, can be made appropriately low remains to be seen. But certainly from any advice I'd give, you wouldn't be able to turn United around without really tackling that in a very aggressive way.
This is about the bankruptcy system. In our nation's pursuit of airline renewal, is the bankruptcy system a friend or a foe?
Well, I think the bankruptcy system has, first of all, been good for America. I mean, in some senses, we are a land of second chances, and that's what the bankruptcy system in our country allows. So I, for one, would not stand up in front of you here today and argue against the bankruptcy system. I think that what happens is that in going through those second chance type operations, though, if United and U.S. Airways, for example, both of those companies are successful, in getting themselves reorganized under bankruptcy. They will come out with a cost structure that is substantially better than that of the solvent carriers, and it is going to put a tremendous amount of pressure on organizations like Delta, American, Northwest, Continental to revamp their cost structures outside of bankruptcy. I think in some senses that's a bit of a fair fight, and I think that from our standpoint, it's the market that determines what the marketplace wants to pay for the services. We have to put together airlines that have cost structures which are successful and competitive in that context, and bankruptcy can put an appropriate forcing device on it. So I don't have a major quarrel with the bankruptcy laws. I just wish that their target or their effect was being aimed at someone else. It's certainly making it very difficult for us right now, but I think it's an appropriate difficulty for us to bear.
So it sounds like you're not concerned about competing with say, a United Airlines that came out of bankruptcy with a lower cost structure.
The only reason I would not be concerned is if I felt sure that I could in fact match their cost structure, match the cost structure of a bankrupt carrier, but to develop that cost structure outside of bankruptcy. And in fact, clearly that is Delta's aim. I mean, we have every intention of staying out of bankruptcy. We had last year probably the sharpest defined financial goals that I've had in my 35 years of business experience. And that was to put together the most liquid balance sheet we could, and to reduce what is called our daily cash burn, our daily cash loss, as close to zero as possible. And we have the most liquid balance sheet of the large carriers, and our cash burn was close to zero. So Delta has some staying power for all but the most unimaginable consequences, which, and we sit here in pins and needles, probably like many in this room, with respect to the potential implications associated with war. War will have a tremendous impact on the airline industry, and in a very weak industry such as we have right now, it could have very serious repercussions for everybody. But our goal is to have, as I said, to have that bankrupt carrier cost structure, but develop that cost structure outside of bankruptcy. That's an appropriate thing to do.
We're going to switch to the banking industry. Although Jamie Dimon is no longer new to his job, he did come to Bank One from outside the Midwest. What advice would you offer to Jamie Dimon as the leader of Bank One?
Did you ask that question? First of all, I'd say from following Bank One, which has been a little bit far afield for me, given the mergers that have been taking place. I mean, I think Jamie Dimon, frankly, appears to be doing a very good job, and doesn't appear to need a lot of advice from me. But I would turn that into almost a civic comment, if I might, Mike. I would say something that I've said to a number of friends here, is that one of the things that I most regret about having left Chicago is the tremendous civic involvement of the business community, and Atlanta's a great city, but I've been to a lot of cities. I've lived in Washington and Philadelphia and Chicago, and grew up in the Boston area before I went to Atlanta. And this is a fantastic city in which you all reside, and the degree of that civic involvement is wonderful. And so if I were to give Jamie any advice, I'd just say, given the fact that the largest bank in the city, I think, has some both unique responsibilities and unique opportunities to be civically involved, is that he should throw his efforts into it and really make a strong contribution.
What advice would you give him about extending credit to the large airlines?
Which academic asked that question? I think that, first of all, I think there are credit-worthy airlines out there, and you have to choose them one by one. It's in some senses not appropriate to brand an entire industry. Obviously, this is an industry, to use the terms of banking, with great credit risk associated with it. So one has to be careful. But I think that one of the things that I actually feel good about is that Delta has continued to have access to private capital markets throughout all of this difficult period that we've had. We did a major private sector financing just a couple of weeks ago. And so we maintain good relationships with the private capital markets. I think you just have to do your analysis and evaluate each one of the companies in the industry one by one and just be a little more careful.
Let's get to the internet. In the airline industry's pursuit of revenue growth, is the internet a friend or a foe?
The internet is both of those. In terms of to give an idea of what we mean by the friend, it clearly is an enormous and powerful improvement in the distribution of tickets. And when you look, for example, at sales through travel agents, in a couple of years ago, it used to cost Delta roughly $40 or so to sell a ticket through a travel agent. And if you sell a ticket through the internet, you know, that number can be about $3. So there's just a tremendous advantage in terms of the unit cost aspects of selling a ticket. That's the positive side. I would also add, before I go into the negative, and it's kind of have to discuss this in two parts. From the customer side, the internet is a tremendous boon, because what the internet has done is it's made pricing information widely available to everybody who should choose to make even a modicum of effort to find it. It used to be that, say, large corporate customers might have access to the very best prices that an airline would have to offer. And now any person who uses the internet can find and shop for those prices using Orbitz, Expedia.com, Travelocity, Delta.com, United.com, or whatever. Now, what the effect in terms of the negative effect that has had on the industry is what it means is that our capacity to charge any kind of a premium price is virtually gone. And so as a result, ticket sales have become very, very much a commodity pricing type of aspect, and it's made it and compounded the difficulty for us to make any kind of price increases put forward. But you know what? That's kind of our problem. I think that when you look at the internet and you look at it from a public interest standpoint, it's been a great boon to the traveling public. I think it's great for America, and we've just got to get used to taking the effects of the pricing as it impacts on the airlines and just dealing with it.
This is a question about the full-service airline model. How much customer demand still exists for full-service air travel? Is it enough to fill the existing schedule of full-service flights? And more fundamentally, is the full-service business model still viable?
I don't know anybody who's had full service lately. So to use an old Southern expression, I think it's gone with the wind. We say that in Atlanta. And what I think we have done is, and it's consistent with my answer to the previous question, is that there has been a commoditization of air travel. And so in terms of having a truly elite service in the days back even prior to deregulation, when essentially aviation was an elite service, I mean, those days are really gone almost forever. It is today very much a mass market business. Now, again, I think that when one looks at that, that's a not altogether bad thing. I happen to think that the regulation of aviation was one of the great public policy victories of the last part of the past century. Deregulation took place in 1978. In that year, 250 million people traveled. In the year 2000, 650 million people traveled, and airline prices were down in real terms by 40%. And so we had made it possible, even as organizations like Priceline, for example, and others such came along, we have made it possible for almost every person right down into the lower economic brackets of our country to travel. And when you look at the benefits of, say, face-to-face contact to go in terms of unifying a country, making America as strong as it is, as we look around the country in the world, how much we appreciate it these days, and that's a very, very powerful benefit. But what it's meant is that there's a lot of crowds out there, and it's no longer the elite experience that it used to be. And so to the extent that full service was meant elite, those days are gone. I think a lot of the special services also are gone. But I think in general, it's a good thing from the standpoint of the traveling public to have good, solid, inexpensive air travel provided for the great mass of Americans in this country.
Delta will soon launch its new subsidiary, Song, to compete with the likes of Southwest and JetBlue. How is Song different from Delta Express, and why do you believe a lower-cost captive airline can succeed today when they have generally not worked in the past?
Well, I think first point to be made is a general observation, when I made the observation I'm about to make to you 3 years ago at an annual meeting in Delta, it was greeted with a little bit of a shock. But I made the observation that the principal competitors of Delta Airlines were not American Airlines or United Airlines, but were, in fact, Southwest Airlines, AirTran, and JetBlue. JetBlue was just getting started up at that point, but even then we saw its potential. And so the discount carriers have become just an incredible force in the aviation business. It is necessary to compete with them and to meet with them head-on. Delta had established a subsidiary called Delta Express, which in 1995, and at that time it had a differentiated compensation structure for the employees, but it was carried out, the services were carried out very much in an embedded way within the Delta mainline structure. Over the subsequent 5 years, Delta Express frankly lost its identity. And it became just an adjunct. In fact, the reporting responsibility sunk deeper and deeper into the organization. And as we step back in the year 2001, you just asked a fundamental question about why do we have this organizational unit anymore? And it isn't supplying anything like the kind of service that Southwest Airlines or JetBlue was supplying. So we stepped back and asked ourselves, the questions pertaining to what it would take to really meet Southwest Airlines and its like head-on. And the answers were that we had to have a completely separate subsidiary capable of establishing its own culture, but within the holding company. And although it's been said many times that that's a difficult thing to do in a large organization, in fact, it's done every day in large organizations. I made an observation earlier in the day that I had a substantial amount of my experience at First Chicago with the American National Bank, which was a wonderful organization. It operated very successfully within the First Chicago holding structure. I would add that the credit card organization at First Chicago did the same thing. And so having subsidiaries with their own identity and own culture is not an unknown. You just have to make sure you've got the linkages and the walls appropriately defined as to how it's going to relate to the holding company, and that can be done. I think we understand that, and we're doing it. Second thing, it needs its own brand identity that it can convey to the outside public. Hence the choice of a whimsical name, Song, a different color scheme, going to be green and white, not Delta's red, white, and blue. The colors inside the airplane are all going to be all over the place. When you get in there, you won't even know it's a Delta plane. All the flight attendants are going to be wearing multicolored uniforms of their choice. And we've attempted to instill in it right from the start a great spirit. And we asked, in recruiting flight attendants, to get them from the Delta, and you had to apply to Song, and we didn't really know exactly how this would go. We were oversubscribed by 4 to 1. And so there's a great deal of interest in Song and a great deal of spirit that is being shown to join it. The third aspect is the obvious one also. It has to be low cost. And uniquely in this one, typically when Southwest Airlines is a 737 company, meaning it flies just Boeing 737s. We're going to put Boeing 757s into Song. These are big airplanes. They carry around 200 or so customers. It's going to have more room. It's going to look more like JetBlue than anything else. It's not going to look very much like Southwest Airlines. It's going to have some of the best features inside of it that will compete very effectively with the mainline service. And yet, because we're flying the big airplanes, we're going to get the unit cost down to a discount carrier structure. I think that these three things together will clearly make Song a winner. And we're really enthusiastic about it. You referred to the George Will column, a certain amount of bravado in undertaking this. I certainly feel good that Delta is able to undertake an extremely proactive initiative like this during a very troubled time. And we think this is going to work despite the problems others have had in the past.
Leo, I'm sure you saw the article in today's Wall Street Journal on the front page explaining the high labor costs of the major airlines. And also explaining many of the work rules that the airlines had. Reading that article, it seems that the airlines don't have a culture of being cost-effective, of being efficient. Clearly, this has to change to be successful in this new environment. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Well, I think that observation is absolutely right. Tying back to my first answer and the suggestions that might be made to Glenn Tilton, and in fact, Glenn Tilton was featured in that article in the Wall Street Journal today. We have to go at the cost structure with a vengeance. It has to be reset. And when I talked about this 2 to 3 year transition period in my remarks, that's what I was referring to. And this is really hard work for anybody. I mean, when you've taken 16,000 people out, and then when you look in the face of say further cuts or further wage effects that may yet be ahead, have you done enough? It's going to be a pretty tough row for almost everybody in the airline business for the next 1 to 2 years. But I do think it's about a 2-year transition, and then we will have reset it. And I think we're going to come out of this problem with a much stronger industry, with a cost structure that is far more competitively effective.
Could you give us some idea of the magnitude of labor cost cuts that the major airlines are going to need in order to survive?
Well, I think that some of the magnitude is associated with the ratio of 100,000 people. I mean, 15% of the people having already been taken out. At Delta mainline, we're down by 22% in terms of people. I mean, to have done that in about a year and a half, I think is a challenge if anybody looks at it and said you were facing those kinds of reductions. I don't think that the people reductions can go much further, because there is a core amount of service capability that's required. I can assure you, and I don't know any airline executive who would not agree with what I'm about to say, there will be no compromise on safety. I mean, we know that we absolutely have to keep the maintenance of these airplanes up to an absolutely premier level, and there will be no compromise for that. But you reach a base level wherein you just can't go any further, with respect to that, without compromising some of the most important variables that you have. So I think we're about there. We're all working on the wage side of it, which is sort of what's the unit cost of labor right now. By reopening labor contracts, Delta had the unfortunate circumstance with its pilot contract that it signed the contract 5 months before September 11th. So we now have the highest pilot costs in the industry. And in fact, if United is successful in getting its pilot costs to the level that has been advertised and was stated in that Wall Street Journal article, United could be 30% better off in terms of unit pilot costs than Delta. Well, there's no way that Delta could go forward and be successful in the long term with that kind of a variance in pilot cost. We've had a constructive dialogue with our own pilots. We have a contract that goes to the year 2005. This is a real problem for us. And so we have some heavy lifting to do to deal with this issue over time. Each of the airlines has got a special case. Our case is the most important issue that we have is the one to which I just referred.
Leo, you mentioned airline security in your comments. What's your report card on the improvements in airport and airline security since 9/11?
I think that the government has really done a superb job of reassuring the American public on airline security. And in addition, I can tell you, even in the behind-the-scenes type activity, that in terms of any real security threat that we have had, to my knowledge, we haven't had it since September 11th, with the one exception of the Richard Reed case in American, which fortunately was stopped. And so I think that the government has done a very, very good job in that respect. What hasn't happened is the government has not adequately develop the right balance between their responsibilities in recognizing that the job is not to have an extremely secure business that happens to be dying or approaching death. I mean, we have to what we have to have is we have to have a secure and excellent business. And so the government has to come to accept that the customer service aspect of it, that the provision of an appropriate customer experience while traveling is part of the job. The TSA, the Transportation Security Administration, started off with very much of a state police mentality. I mean, in fact, when I first met with the deputy administrator of the TSA, I found myself talking to a really good man, but he was the former head of the state police in Michigan. And I will tell you that the definition of customer service to a state policeman is different than what you and I might think. And so, you know, we've got quite a distance to go here in terms of getting the right balance in it. But on the whole, I commend the government for the job that it has done. I think it's provided very good security. They have to deal with the cost issues that I outlined, and they really have to develop a better orientation towards the customer.
One of the long-term problems that the industry faces is the air traffic control system. What are your thoughts on what should be done to fix it on a long-term basis?
You know, it was interesting in thinking about this speech as I came here is that my previous invitation to address an audience here in Chicago was on September the 14th, I believe, 2001. And of course, so it was just a couple of days after, and I was lined up to come up here and talk to the commercial club. And I had the speech written, and in preparing for this speech, I went back and looked at what I was going to be talking about on that day. And it's interesting that there was not a single overlay of topics between when I talked to you tonight and what I was going to talk about on that day. On that day, I was in fact talking about the problems of the FAA. I was talking about airport expansions. I was going to mention the crowdedness of the skies and the fact that we were having such great difficulties in dealing with customer service when the crowds were so great. And now I look back on those happy days and just wished I had those problems. And I was going to mention relative to runways that in essence, that the problems with respect to capacity of our airports in this country could be alleviated by 2 miles of runway at 25 airports in the country, 50 miles of runway. Now, this was in a country where we face all kinds of environmental types of impacts, environmental impact statements and the like, but in a country where we have built 42,500 miles of interstate highways, and yet we have all this problem in building 50 miles of runways. And you haven't asked me the O'Hare question yet, but maybe it's...
That's next.
Oh, okay. But I was going to talk about that and the FAA. I think that the capacity problems of airports and the problems with the FAA in terms of the air traffic control system, which were very, very serious in the year 2000 prior to September 11th, have been given a break because of the fact that there are now 15% fewer airplanes in the sky. And that has a huge effect in terms of the ability of airports and the FAA's air traffic control system to handle the situation. And as a result, in the past year and a half since September 11th, I have never participated in a serious conversation pertaining to problems with respect to capacity and the air traffic control system. It's like it disappeared off the face of the earth. However, I will tell you that I think that this is a short-lived hiatus. I think that the problem will come back in roughly the year 2005, and by the year 2006, a lot of us, if somebody were given this speech at that time, did end up talking about these subjects as being the most important that aviation faced.
Do we have the technology in place to significantly improve the air traffic control system now?
We have a massive amount of technology both in place and under development. It's an extraordinarily sophisticated system, and in many respects I stand in awe of it. I mean, and the more I learn about it, the more convinced I am of its capabilities. I think there are some major policy and technological changes that are now being considered by the new FAA administrator, and I'm reasonably confident that we're moving in the right direction in this. Yes, the technology is there, and it's very good.
Okay, let's get to the O'Hare question. Do you support the expansion plan for O'Hare in the current economic climate?
I'm an expansionist, and I think I began working on O'Hare, I don't know, around 1991 or thereabouts, as part of a Chamber of Commerce task force, and it's very, very interesting to look at all of the obstacles that have been put in front of it. I will point out in the case of Atlanta, that, as you know, Hartsfield Airport in Atlanta and O'Hare have been virtually tied for many years in terms of the passenger traffic and number of planes that are handled at those two airports. And when I arrived at Delta in 1997, we were engaged in a tremendous battle about a fifth runway at Hartsfield. I will tell you that runway is now approved. The dirt is being moved, the cement is being poured, the houses have been condemned and taken down, and the appropriate removals have been made. I think O'Hare has really I just could not endorse more strongly the fact that it should proceed and proceed aggressively. These are long projects. These are long projects. O'Hare, as with the ATC and airports generally, is getting a break by virtue of the fact that the traffic and the air travel is down. But that should not be interpreted as anything more than a short-term hiatus. And I would fully support, not only from my knowledge of it locally, but also in terms of O'Hare's position in the national aviation system, that it be moved forward as aggressively as possible.
Okay, Leo, this will be our last question, and it's about comparing Atlanta and Chicago. In Atlanta, and I want to tell you that we won't tell anyone in Atlanta what your answer is to the question tonight. But in Atlanta and Chicago, you've lived and worked in regions facing enormous challenges. Georgia, in fact, recently had to create a new Greater Atlanta Regional Transportation Authority to reduce traffic congestion and air pollution under threat of having its federal funds cut off. So which region do you think is doing a better job of preparing for success in the global economy 20 years from now?
Chicago.
Leo, thank you so much for joining us tonight. There's great comments and great answers to questions, as always. We're delighted to have you here, and we hope you'll come back soon.
I thought it was excellent, actually. So we're lucky to have him come back and share his thoughts with us. I was particularly interested in what he had to say about the airlines, in a sense, shouldering part of our national defense cost.
Speech was brilliant in the sense that really gave a perspective that I haven't seen in the press in terms of the airline's view of some of the problems, as opposed to just the consumer's view, which you tend to read about every day.
I thought his candor was remarkable. I think, considering we've had a number of transportation leaders speaking to us, he's the one who certainly didn't mince words. He told it exactly how it is, and I thought it was refreshing to hear this kind of truth.
I thought Leo did an outstanding job. He's in a position to be a true business leader, and he has done a phenomenal job in his many positions here in Chicago, as well as on this incredibly political and difficult issue of the airline industry.
He's as direct and frank as he was here, and I think, I agree with the comment that it's an industry that requires direct and frankness. And I don't think it's an industry that requires and has a lot of time to think about what you need to do. So you have to be pretty decisive and very thoughtful about the decisions you have to make. And I think he certainly conveyed that.
Well, I guess the comparison between technology services and the airlines right now is that these are industries that are in economic difficulty at this point. But the economic difficulty in no means minimizes the importance of those industries to the future of American economy. And I think, in fact, these industries are quite intertwined, because technology and airlines, whether it's information services or security or otherwise, is going to be highly, highly critical to the success of those industries and the economy in general.
Similar type of consolidation, similar type of issues in terms of dealing with competing in a less regulated environment, competition that is all across the board. And There's some very interesting parallels if you look at the number of fewer banks specifically that exist today versus just 10 years ago. Whoever would have thought that the second capital of banking in the United States would be in the Southeast as opposed to it used to be in San Francisco or Chicago.
It's great to have Leo have had such a great success in his career here in Chicago and to be an ambassador to Chicago's business community and other places. And so
Although
we're
he
happy
went
to
to
see
the
him.
other business school, right? I went to the University of Chicago. So.
Yeah, I'm a Northwestern guy, but he did a great job, and we're happy to have him speaking.
It's good to see that Chicago develops leaders that go out and certainly are impactful in other parts of the country. I think it speaks a lot to the universities here, the economic development, the companies. I think it's good to be a net producer of talent for the world.